Right, let's dive into this explainer. We're going to unpack exactly how British rule systematically transformed and really completely dismantled India's traditional economy over the course of 2 centuries. This isn't just your standard story of military conquest. It's a fascinating, if pretty sobering, look at a massive, deliberate, structural rewiring of an entire subcontinent's economic engine.
Just think about this staggering fact for a second. According to historians, back at the start of the 18th century, India commanded a massive 23% of the entire global economy. But fast forward to when India finally gained independence, that share had plummeted to just 3%. I mean, that is a breathtaking contraction. We're talking about a region that went from being one of the world's most productive economic powerhouses to one of its poorest nations. So, how does a collapse of that absolute magnitude actually happen?
Well, to understand how this massive economic drain went down, here is our roadmap for today. We'll cover the fall of India's economy, the 3 stages of colonialism, deindustrialization and rural decline, commercialization and devastating famines, lopsided industrial development, and finally, the nationalistic awakening.
All right, Section 1, the fall of India's economy.
So let's look at how earlier invaders differed fundamentally from the British colonists. The core shift here was, well, total. You see, previous invaders who came to India absolutely took wealth, for sure, but they didn't fundamentally alter the structural setup of the Indian economy. They weren't draining away wealth continuously as tribute to some foreign mainland. The British, though, they orchestrated a complete transformation. India was shifted from being a dominant, self-sustaining net exporter of highly prized finished goods, especially textiles, into a captive colonial economy. The whole shebang was rewired for the interests of the British economy, basically forcing India to become a net importer of cheap British machine-made goods and just a supplier of raw materials. Moving right along to Section 2, the 3 stages of colonialism.
Now, a crucial point to remember is that this wasn't accidental. It wasn't just a byproduct of changing times. As Marxist historian Rajani Palmadot pointed out, it happened through a calculated, evolving system of extraction across 3 overlapping stages. From 1757 to 1813, we have the period of merchant capital, or mercantilism. The East India Company just wanted to monopolize trade and grab government revenues. They weren't changing the social structures quite yet. But then, Britain industrialized. That kicks off the second stage, the colonialism of free trade, running from 1813 to the 1860s. British industrial capitalists suddenly needed a giant market for their new manufactured goods and raw materials, which forced India's deep integration into the global capitalist economy. Finally, from the 1860s onward, we hit the era of foreign investments. This is where British finance capital swooped in to dominate modern sectors, bringing along much tighter, reactionary political controls.
If we zoom in on that second stage, it's pretty wild how explicitly rigged the rules were. The Charter Act of 1813 allowed for this incredibly ironic one-way free trade. British machine-made imports completely flooded the Indian market, totally duty-free. Meanwhile, if Indian products tried to reach European markets, they faced punishing tariffs of nearly 80%. Literally by 1820, European markets were virtually locked tight against Indian exports. At the same time, British capitalists got a free pass to develop tea and indigo plantations, railways, and trade. It was a completely uneven playing field, purpose-built to hollow out India's native industries. Which brings us to Section 3, deindustrialization and rural decline. Let's look at the direct, on-the-ground human impact of these macro-level policies. We see this tragic demographic shift known as the cycle of ruralization. Now in Europe, the massive loss of traditional artisan jobs was absorbed by a booming industrial revolution, right? Well, India experienced the exact opposite. Since no modern industries were being built to replace the old ones, millions of ruined artisans facing starvation wages and repressive policies lost their livelihoods. They had absolutely no choice but to abandon their ancestral professions and retreat to the villages to take up farming. This sudden influx massively overburdened agriculture and completely upended the traditional village economic setups. And what actually awaited them in those villages? Total devastation. The peasant became the ultimate sufferer, crushed under what we can call a triple burden: the government, the zamindar, and the moneylender. Under systems like the permanent settlement, the government demanded maximum revenue. To extract it, they empowered a new class of zamindars, who were often absentee landlords living far away in towns. These guys had immense power to evict tenants and demand illegal dues, and zero incentive to actually invest in improving the farms. To meet these ruthless demands, the desperate peasant had to turn to the third and maybe most devastating layer of this burden: the village moneylender.
The moneylender would force the farmer to sell their produce at rock-bottom prices just to clear debts, trapping the peasantry in this relentless, inescapable cycle of landlessness and crushing poverty.
Let's turn to Section 4, Commercialization and Devastating Famines.
By the late 19th century, agriculture itself was forcibly transformed from a way of life into a highly risky business enterprise. Instead of growing food grains for the village to actually eat, peasants were forced into growing cash crops, things like cotton, jute, and tea. This was entirely driven by British finance capital and the aggressive rollout of the railways. But for the subsistence-level Indian peasant, this forced commercialization was an absolute disaster. It tied their very survival to wild, unpredictable international market fluctuations. Take the American Civil War in the 1860s, for example. Cotton fetched sky-high prices, but all those profits went straight to the intermediaries. When a massive market slump hit in 1866, the cultivators got horrific whiplash. They were left with nothing, sparking massive debt and fierce agrarian riots.
The human toll of this colonial poverty is almost unimaginable. We're looking at an estimated 2.8 crore people. That is 28 million human beings who died in recurring famines between 1850 and 1900 alone. Just sit with that number for a second. The source material emphasizes a truly critical point here. These famines were not simply natural disasters. They weren't just about a bad harvest or a scarcity of food grains. They were the direct result of the systemic poverty unleashed by colonial economic forces. This system entirely stripped the peasantry of any surplus or financial resilience they once had.
Moving on to Section 5, Lopsided Industrial Development. Any industrial development that did occur during this time was incredibly lopsided. For instance, India had a thriving, centuries-old shipbuilding industry that was deliberately crushed by giving British ships monopolies and slapping heavy taxes on Indian merchant ships. Or take Indian entrepreneurs who tried to build heavy industries like steel production. They faced massive hurdles and were restricted to producing only lower standards of steel, completely locking them out of broader domestic markets. When modern industries finally did pop up, like the 1853 Bombay Cotton Mill or the 1855 Rishra Jute Mill, the landscape was completely dominated by foreign capital swooping in for high profits and cheap labor. Heavy industry and technical education completely neglected by the colonial administration.
Okay, our final section, number 6, the Nationalist Awakening.
So, how did the people of India eventually respond to this systematic impoverishment? Well, by the 1860s, the grand illusion that British rule would naturally modernize India really began to shatter. Early politically conscious intellectuals started to probe the reality of the colonial economy. The foremost among them was Dadabhai Naoroji, known as the Grand Old Man of India. In his groundbreaking work, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, he put forward the famous drain theory. This was the radical yet empirically backed concept that one country was systematically draining wealth away from another, transforming India into a mere supplier of raw materials.
The sheer scale of the extraction these early analysts calculated is mind-boggling. Nationalist estimates argued that the economic drain consumed a third of the subcontinent's total savings. To put that into perspective, they estimated it was more than the entire land revenue collected, or half the total government revenue, amounting to roughly 8% of the national product. And this wasn't just some complex, abstract economic theory debated in universities. The idea of a foreign power siphoning away hard-earned wealth was immediately grasped by a nation of peasants who lived this exact exploitation every single day.
Grasping this economic reality completely shattered the ideological myth of benevolent British rule. The British loved to argue that railways and foreign trade were proof of development, right? But nationalist analysts proved that railways were really just tools to help foreign goods outsell indigenous products. By framing poverty as a man-made national issue, it united all sections of society around common economic grievances. This intellectual unrest between 1875 and 1905 was the vital seed time of the national movement. It served as the primary catalyst that shifted the demand from simply wanting a small share in political power to a full-throated, undeniable demand for complete self-rule.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative question. When we look at the deliberate dismantling of a massive economy over 2 centuries, we really have to consider the long, enduring shadow of colonialism. How does historical economic extraction continue to shape modern wealth disparities today? How much of our modern world is still built on these historical blueprints? It is definitely something to think deeply about as we strive to understand the true, lasting economic impact of history.